All right, thank you. When Sam Shuka was speaking, he mentioned a clearinghouse for information on sea level rise, and then there was a question later emphasizing the clearinghouse. If you all stick around till 5 o'clock today, you're going to hear about a great tool that's going to be made available to all of you, hopefully for at least the next 10 years in relationship to a clearinghouse related to climate change and conservation research. So stick around for that. Our next speaker is Craig Moritz. Craig is the director of the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology on the Berkeley campus. He's a professor of integrated biology. He was elected a few years ago to the California Academy of Sciences and has been involved the last 3 years in some very interesting research related to identifying evolutionary hotspots on the California landscape to improve our conservation program in terms of protection of not only great places, habitat types, but also processes that allow species to adapt to current existing conditions. And it's just a natural that this research would fold right into climate change and what we can do in the future with those hotspots. So, Craig.
Thank you very much for the invitation to come along. Dan's a very hard act to follow. We're doing a substantial shift now back to the biology that I know and love. But of course it all has to be looked at in the context of the sort of policy shifts in economics that Dan was talking about. So I want to do two things today. I want to talk about dynamics of biological diversity over longer time scales, focusing on the evolutionary process itself, that being the process that drives diversification, that creates diversity, spreads it around the landscape, and gives us what we have to work with now and will so again in the future. And then I want to segue from that into some work we've been doing recently, looking at changes in distributions of birds and mammals over the last 100 years, that is in response to the climate change that has already happened. And I guess if there's a general theme, it is that to predict the future we have to understand the past. Now that's not rocket science. Any economist knows it, any social scientist knows it, any politician knows it. So much of what we're doing at the moment are projections into the future that are largely untested by reference to the past. So I'm going to take us a little bit backwards and look somewhat at the past. So in the broad sense, California is and has been for many decades now, a terrific laboratory of evolution. What does that do? That's scary. Ah! Help! Oh, I see. There you go. So many evolutionary biologists over the last few decades have used California as a natural laboratory because it has this extraordinary environmental and topographic diversity across which the plants, the vertebrates and the insects have diversified in the past. And many of our current major concepts in evolution were born from science done in California on this terrific landscape and biota. So our next challenge then is to understand, has this driven specific places in the landscape that have unusual properties that drive diversification? What can we do to protect those? Let me just make this go away. Go away. Help. I'm a professor, I don't know how to do this stuff. What have I done? Ah, you're marvellous. Oh, the big button that says forward. Excellent. So we want to find out where on the landscape are these hotspots of diversification, and then are these likely to persist? Are these sort of environmental features that drive diversification still going to be there with future climate change? And what land protection strategy might minimise the loss of these sort of landscapes or maximise their resilience? So some months ago, a couple of years ago now, Rick came to us, a bunch of evolutionary biologists, rat catchers, lizard chasers, bird watchers, botanists, and said, right, you've been talking about evolution and conservation, now do it. And we thought, oh my goodness, how on earth do we go about doing this? And it was very exciting as an academic exercise, but also to try and respond to a policy-driven challenge. And that is, if there is to be, and there will be, an active process of land acquisition by the state, by NGOs, land trusts and so on, how can they invest their money in a way that will maximise the future evolutionary potential of California and maximise its resilience in the face of escalating global change? That's a terrific challenge, and one that we've really enjoyed working on. Now, it's not a totally new concept, this idea of trying to protect landscapes as dynamic entities and to protect not just the pattern of diversity, the current distribution of species, vegetation types, but to protect the ecological and evolutionary dynamics that have created that diversity and will continue to change it. The South Africans are way ahead of us. Richard Cowling and other people there in the state government have been looking at their protected area landscape and trying to think about effects of both future climate change, but also how to maximise protection of the evolutionary processes that made South Africa, like California, a global hotspot of diversity. So they look at things with respect to plant diversification, like steep climatic gradients, gradients in soil types, all the things that are very familiar, particularly to botanists working in California, that shape the current pattern of diversity. So how can we come up with a landscape system based largely on linkages across environmental gradients that would achieve those aims? And my understanding is that this is now having a very tangible influence on the conservation planning policy and land acquisition in South Africa. Now, a lot of these concepts aren't new. They've been mentioned several times today. Protect linkages, protect gradients. And I'll come back to that again and again. So our challenge then was to, this is a very busy slide, don't worry about the detail. The challenge was to look across the California landscape and say, well, can we use existing data, not new data, but existing data, and identify where in the landscape are these hotspots of diversification? Or to put it simply, where do we have concentrations of young species that have evolved in the past few thousands, tens of thousands of years? So to do that, we've focused so far on mammals and amphibians, and there's a project underway on plants as well. Other groups, particularly down in San Diego, are working on invertebrates, and we hope eventually to bring it together. But the notion was to take what we know about the geographic ranges of species, and for this purpose we produced much higher resolution maps than I'd normally used, based on the specimens we hold in museums and herbaria, and high-resolution modelling methods. So you can take the endemic species in California, which we focused on. For mammals, there's just 26, 130 subspecies, produce these sort of high-resolution range maps, and then connect them to existing information on DNA sequence-based phylogenies, and ask for each endemic species, where does it occur, how different is it in evolutionary terms and in time from its most closely related species. So we're using phylogenies, distributions, and putting them together, and looking for areas where we're getting sort of coinciding young species on the landscape. And then think about what are the landscape attributes that are generating that diversity. So I'm just going to take you through some of the results in sort of cartoon fashion, but there is a lot of data cleaning and data analysis that underlies the pretty maps that I'll show you. So this is the result of the analysis for the mammals, and obviously you know the state. We've also shown some of the federal and state protected areas, or at least federal lands, public lands around the state. The red areas on the map are the areas that are concentrations of subspecies, which are sort of packets of adaptive variation, if you like, on the landscape, in crude terms. And the yellow are the areas that are concentrations of very young species across the landscape. And in several places they coincide. So particularly on the central coast, we're getting coincident distributions of very young species and also phenotypic variation, that is, variation in sort of morphology and phenotype that natural selection has produced. Likewise, in the Central Sierra, through the Tehachapis, turns out to be a very important area, and the transverse ranges and bits of the peninsular ranges. So although there are endemic species distributed well around the state, these are the areas that, from just the perspective of the mammals alone, seem to have the landscapes that have driven recent diversification. That is our evolutionary hotspots. And the point I'll come to later is many of these areas do offer great potential for, through coordinated land acquisition, to protect these sorts of gradients. Some are much more difficult, like the Santa Cruz Ranges and the Santa Lucia Ranges. There's terrific opportunity here that many of you in this room know about and are working on. Some areas, like the Central Sierra, are already well encompassed by public lands. So if we turn to the amphibian diversity, something quite remarkable has happened in the last few years. California now has 40 plus endemic species of amphibians and counting, and about half of these are in this one group of slender salamanders. These are the little pencil-like salamanders you'll find under rubbish lying around in your garden if you live in a wet place. They're really common. It used to be 2 species, it's now 20 and counting. This is the work of one of my colleagues, David Wake, and his students. And this isn't taxonomist splitting hairs. It just turns, or splitting salamanders, or whatever. These things actually look like hairs, just big fat hairs. But in fact, if you look at them closely and study their DNA and their proteins and their distributions, you really do find that there's much more diversity than anyone realised. And in fact, I think this is the map that got Rick Rayburn going on this in the first place, when you look down in the southern Sierra and you've got all these species with tiny little ranges. Many of these are very ancient lineages, just sitting down in areas that are protected from drying out and have remained wet enough for these lungless salamanders to survive in. So tremendous narrow range endemism, that is species with very, very small distributions. And it's not unique here, there's new ones turning up again on the south central coast, and other little sort of topographic patches through here in other areas. Whereas the north of the state has basically one widespread thing, in the south there's tremendous local diversification. Similar patterns are turning up for some of the invertebrates as well, and Andy Bahonak and others are here who do more of that sort of work. So again, if we sort of massage the data, take the distributions, the phylogenies, and put the story together, it looks something like this. For amphibians, this endemism richness map really highlights the endemic species, the unique species to California that have very small geographic ranges. So here you see the Batrachoceps effect, the southern Californian things. There's a bufo here, there's another salamander up here. But again, the central coast, the sort of central Sierras and foothills and peninsular ranges come up as important areas. And again, with the neo-endemism, the pattern's more complex, but I'll go straight to the comparison with mammals. And there are certain features that are turning up again and again in these independent groups. So again, the south central coast, the central Sierra as a region, and then various regions through the transverse peninsular ranges seem to be important for both taxonomic groups. And this just highlights, if you want to pick 3 top areas to focus on, to protect these landscapes. Here we're not talking about protecting the individual species. We're talking about protecting the environmental setting that drives diversification. And if this has any value, then it's not just about the mammals and amphibians, but it's about all the little stuff. The snails and the insects and so on that are evolving across these same landscapes. Now that's a hypothesis to be tested. So again, Central Coast, particularly the Santa Cruz and Santa Lucia Range, Central Sierra and the transverse ranges would be my 3 top picks. Now, what we're doing isn't a totally new idea again. And in fact, Ledyard Stebbins, one of the sort of giants of evolutionary botany in California, did this sort of exercise back in the 60s with data we'd now regard as very incomplete, but it showed great vision and understanding of the plants, the 2,000 odd unique California plants. He looked at areas that had recently evolved species based on their chromosome counts, and I won't go into the details, but again, he picked out this area in the Central Coast as being an area, as well as areas in the Central Sierra, as having, again, very rapid rates of diversification in plants. And we're now getting more data to look at this. So the same theme is coming up. And this they link to both the current environmental gradients in these areas, but also the recent in evolutionary terms, evolution of the full Mediterranean type climate in California. So if we take these areas now and ask, well, what's the landscape look like? This is very preliminary. We're still pulling these data together. But one thing we did was to overlap these areas of coincident hotspots between mammals, birds, and mammals, amphibians, and in this area the plants, and overlaid on a map of ecological integrity that Frank Davis and colleagues at UC Santa Barbara produced some years ago. The white being good, black being bad. I mean, you can tell that just glancing at the map. And there are areas that have great opportunity through collaboration between the local land trusts and TNC and state parks and the UC Reserve System and so on, to protect some of these larger scale landscapes over which evolution can operate. Other areas, as I said, are more challenging, like the Santa Cruz Ranges. Good opportunity up here. This area is already largely protected, or at least in federal lands. Much more interesting challenges down here around the LA Basin and adjacent ranges. But perhaps not hopeless. So there is something that can be done. Looking forward to how this might interact, so just because these are areas where recent evolution has occurred doesn't mean that they'll be sustainable in the longer term under climate change. And we all know climates have changed in California, and we've just started in very simplistic and heuristic fashion to ask where might these sorts of landscapes shift with climate change. And I'm not pretending this is the answer, because it doesn't even include fog and how fog is going to change. But here's sort of a cartoon version of one possibility. Here's a couple of the hotspots, Santa Cruz, Santa Lucia, with shifts in the distribution of the environmental space over which this evolution has occurred now toward the coast. But again, that all depends on what happens with the maritime fog influence. The areas like the Central Sierra, it simply disappears off the map. So these landscapes will shift, but to the extent to which they're protected on steep elevational gradients will minimise that, or at least increase the resilience of the system. To finish off, I want to move from speculation about the future to direct evidence on what past climate change has done to the distributions of these same species in California, focusing on this Central Sierra hotspot. And this is in the context of a large project underway in the Museum of Vertebrate Zoology tonight, and although nothing's been mentioned yet, but there is a reception at the museum after the conference is done today. Perhaps the organisers will say more about that. We hope as many of you can come as possible. Come and see the dead rats, the dead birds, lizards, salamanders, all the cool stuff. These collections now are 100 years old and is one of several research museums at Berkeley. And they offer a terrific record, a very detailed record of the distributions of biodiversity in California 100 years ago. So our notion, it's a very simple one, and in fact, this is way too many words, but this is a really cool paragraph. Basically, Grinnell, who set the museum up, and the benefactor, Annie Alexander, who's aiming her gun directly at Grinnell, so get it right, Joe, argued that his purpose in setting this museum up 100 years ago was so that people could come back in a century and see what's changed. That took terrific foresight in the early 20th century to think of that. But he did, and we still have the collections. and all the field notes and everything that goes with it. So the collections are made all around California. We're just going to zoom in on this bit. We are also now working up here, down here, and we hope through partnerships to expand the project. But I'll show you just some initial results, and in fact, you've already had, I'll skip over that, that's where we hope you'll come. In fact, you've already got the headlines from Mark Rofshovsky. So this is the Yosemite transect, starting in the Central Valley around Snelling, up over the Yosemite National Park, outlined here, over to Mono Basin. They did it with 1,000 man days, all these field notes, specimens, photographs. We have all of those, they're all online. You can look at them yourself. We've gone back and looked at mammal distributions. Shown here is a series of elevational plots from 0 to up over 10,000 feet. Left hand being Grinnell's surveys, these being our surveys, so on and so forth. And the bottom line is that this set of species, pikers, alpine chipmunk, building ground squirrels, golden mantle squirrels, all things we know and love, heather voles, which you don't see so often, these have all moved up in their lower ranges by about 500 metres on average. That's not very subtle change. That's really dramatic stuff over 100 years. So this is an upwards contraction of the ranges, which is not good for a high elevation species. Some have had range collapses. The left one is a bushy-tailed wood rat. This is the shadow or Allen's chipmunk. They've had terrific range collapses, and this is in Yosemite National Park. So this is not due to land use change, it's in one of our conservation icons. But other things don't change. So some of the gophers, marmots, another species of chipmunk, shrews, which are high elevation specialists also, haven't changed. So there's this biological heterogeneity. We can't take one size fits all in terms of our expectations of future responses. And then, as Mark also mentioned, a couple of things, most notably the shrew, have moved down, in this case by about 1,000 metres. So highly variable responses. Some of these can be associated with fire, stand replacing fires. So we have a direct ecological cause, that's fine. But others, in fact Mark used this slide before, are much more perplexing. This is a kilometre upward shift of this pinyon juniper mouse into high elevation conifer forest. Truly astounding result. So some of the dynamics we're seeing are natural ecological dynamics, some are related to fire and normal ecological succession processes, but the big signature is one of climate change. And there's all sorts of data now emerging, still not good enough really for our purposes, but getting there, of really substantial warming in monthly minimum temperatures over the last 100 years in the Central Sierra. So this leads me to suggest, at least for us, whether it is for you as your own decision, a really urgent and emerging research priority. We have several of these historical data sets around California. I've shown you just a tiny glimpse of one of them. We have from the 20s, 30s and 40s vegetation maps and 20,000 plant plots scattered around California. Groups at Davis and Berkeley are protecting that information and digitising it. We have this fantastic data on faunal distributions. We have, at the moment, really poor climate data on the early 20th century, which desperately needs to be improved to interpret these biological changes that we've already seen. So this definitely needs work. It is clear already that the spatial patterns of climate change in California have been really heterogeneous. Some areas have cooked, some might have even cooled a bit. And we're not going to understand how things have already responded unless we understand these spatial patterns of change in the past and in the future. So I think this is a really important exercise. I think we can make any projections we like into the future of how the vegetation and species will respond, but if we don't train those projections, if we don't test them against historical data, they will remain speculation. And I don't think you want to base billions of dollars of investment on speculation. You want solid evidence. So I think that's doable through a partnership between the state and the UC system. The other thing I'd point out is that the UC Natural Reserve System also has tremendous untapped resources in terms of long-term ecological knowledge over decades of research, and it's still mostly locked up in academia. And again, as a partnership, there's the potential to bring that out and put it to work for the land trusts, for the state parks, and for the community. Thank you.
Any questions for Craig?
Thank you, Dr. Moritz. Something you said, you may not know the answer to this, but you mentioned the fog. And the fog is incredibly important in coastal California. It's why a lot of us don't need air conditioning. Has anybody studied what's going to happen to the fog? Is there going to be more of it, less of it, different times?
I'm not a climatologist. Boy, that's coming up again and again today, isn't it? Don't ask me, I'm not a climatologist. I know people are trying to produce at least good maps of the current fog influence and its current input to total precipitation, particularly in the redwood areas, because they're totally fog dependent. Whether our future and past climate change models can handle fog and its very important contribution to total water balance, I don't know. Perhaps somebody else in the audience does. But
Where's Ruskin? Ruskin Martin?
yeah, I would sure like to know the answer to that question. I think it's very important. Yeah, please.
I don't know the answer either. I'm Jane Long from Lawrence Livermore Lab, but I do know that we are looking towards trying to make more detailed models of what the climate is going to do. Most of the climate models that are used for IPCC, et cetera, are resolved on about a 200, 300 kilometer pixel size, if you want, which doesn't help tell you about the fog. So models we're developing now are down at the 6 kilometer range, and when you get down at that range, you're going to begin to see fog. And we have models that will be able to do regional climate under development that will be able to embed those in long-term trends, both in the atmospheric forcing and as well as land use issues. And that's what has to happen if we're going to understand the answer to that question. We're going to have to do those kind of studies.
Thank you.
Is there? It's on. All right. I'm very interested in your map of the biodiversity hotspots, the evolutionary hotspots, and I wonder, is there a correlation between stressors and an accelerated evolutionary pattern in some of those areas?
That's a very good question. It was, is there any connection between environmental stress and rate of evolution or speciation in our particular case in these systems? The sort of conceptual underpinnings of what I'm talking about sort of go back to the sort of basic ideas in evolutionary biology, and in short they are that you're more likely to evolve new forms, new species, new phenotypes in response to natural selection pushing in different directions. So environmental heterogeneity, steep gradients, and those products are more likely to survive in where there's ecological space for them to thrive. So open niche space in technical terms. So it is striking, and we're doing a formal analysis of this, but it's striking that many of the hotspots are in areas with very steep environmental gradients, areas that are geologically very active, creating new juxtapositions of communities, new landscapes, or areas that were recently deglaciated, which are also steep gradients. The sorts of environmental stress we're causing now through pollution or climate change or invasive species certainly do engender an evolutionary response, but it's unlikely, I think, that evolution is going to be able to keep up with the rate of environmental change. Migration and managing for migration responses, which has been stressed here today, I think is a much better insurance policy than one based on species overcoming climate change by evolution.
This might be, if I can interrupt for a second, this is a good opportunity
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. I brought with me copies of a report that we just put out on the web. We're going to put out on the web in the next couple of weeks. We're going to make it available to everybody on this list. We undertook a fairly ambitious project. The Institute of the Environment is really interested in doing what we can to accelerate the movement of new science into policy and in decision making. And it is not a foregone conclusion that if you put scientists and policymakers in the same room together that you're going to get answers coming out. But you have leading edge people like we have here at Craig who are willing to answer questions that are hard questions and have their research adjusted. So we brought together evolutionary scientists from all over the world who are looking at using brand new biotechnology, or using that technology to observe in real time evolutionary changes that are occurring because of human activities. And I think that there were some conclusions that came out of that research that are talked about in the report that we're about to put out. But I think that the lessons that I have as a person who's a conservation practitioner, not a scientist, a couple of which I wanted to share with you are that, in fact, maintaining genetic diversity of the kind that Craig has talked about and Victoria will talk about is absolutely crucial to maintaining biodiversity in general, and that climate change, in fact, is happening too fast. What he just said is correct, that it's happening too fast for species to adapt. We're not going to be able to help species adapt unless we slow climate change. So it's going to have to be partnerships, and the kinds of things that Dr. Kamen was talking about are critically important. Things have to slow down if we have any hope of species adapting and are helping them to do so. And I think it's also important, it reflects what Craig was saying, is that a lot of people would like to see us shift all of our energies into focusing just on the climate change issue. But in fact, for biodiversity, those things that have been hurting species survival all along are actually aggravated in the sense of climate, in the area of climate change. So our captive breeding programs in fishing, hunting, and the way that we deal with species in the wild, basically many times are breeding out genetic variability and reducing the ability of species to adapt to climate change. Invasive species and exotic pathogens are inhabiting large ranges of habitats. They're very versatile, and they have no natural predators, and they can become evolutionary more fit than local species. Some research that was presented at this conference says that lots of invasive exotics come in and they're latent for 5 years while they're acquiring new this sounds like invasion of the body snatchers, but while they're acquiring new genetic traits, and suddenly in 5 years there's an explosion. They take over whole habitats and they're impossible to eradicate. So that says something about the importance of continuing to try to prevent the introduction of invasive species and getting at them very early. Habitat fragmentation and degradation really cuts the ability of population flow, gene flow between populations, and genetic variability between species. So we can't stop doing what we have been doing. We have to continue doing what we have been doing. We have to do it better. We have to use more science to do it. And we have to also then help species to adjust to climate change. I think Craig is also right that it's going to be very hard for species to evolve in place. And so I question, and this is a question I would have asked of you, Craig, is I question whether or not California is the home of endemism in the United States. And the question is, if we have such specialized climates and such specialized topography, and if there's not only just blockages of freeways and other things in urbanization, but literally we have such niche ecosystems, oughtn't we be focusing on those species and habitats that are more movable, or do we need to preserve these ecosystem niches to be able to have these in these evolutionary hotspots so that there's more adaptivity? I hope that question isn't completely unclear, but I think that there's a lot of issues about what we're doing now and what we need to change that we have to raise. Evolutionary scientists, other than people like Craig and Victoria, mainly live in their labs. They don't come out, they don't answer, are not observing what we're doing. So there's a huge need for us to create this this connection. I didn't, when I went to UCLA, I really didn't understand these issues. But I submit to you that we can't continue to do our jobs considering we are evolving species without that. Thank you.
Hello? There. Hi, Jean Panic from the Air Resources Board. I just wanted to ask a specific question about the Grinnell survey, which is this amazing resource that so many people cite because there's so few examples out there of ecological responses to physical changes. And you have something that's really well documented. It's just an amazing piece of work. So I wanted to ask about some of the reasons behind the changes that you see in the elevational shifts in the species ranges, and what kinds of insights that gives us into whether things are responding to climate change in sync, whether vegetation is moving with the species that need the vegetation, whether they eat it or they live in it or they use the shade from it or whatever. But are these things moving in sync, or are you seeing that climate change is actually creating problems in the resources that these species need?
Yeah, they're really good questions. First, thanks for your kind words about the project. It's also a lot of fun just going out and doing it. The responses we're seeing are very heterogeneous. So along with that is that communities are reorganizing. So between species that we thought interacted very closely and replaced each other, particularly in things like the chipmunks and the mice, we're also seeing it with the birds, the ecological communities are changing really drastically, particularly at high elevations. They are also, in some cases, moving ahead of vegetation change. So the pinyon juniper mouse is a classic. We thought on the east side of the Sierra that it lives in pinyon juniper woodlands. That's why it's got its name. Now it's up in whitebark pine and hemlock. So our notion of species ecological associations is usually from a snapshot in time. So I think one of the messages there that is we can't necessarily predict what the fauna is going to do on the basis of its current vegetation associations. Another message is that we certainly shouldn't be maintaining or seeking to conserve static communities. Now, any paleontologist will tell you there is no such thing as a particular species assemblage structure through time. We know from the fossil record that rodents behave idiosyncratically with past climate change, and we're seeing the same thing now over the last 100 years. So it poses a certain management challenge, a big management challenge. But one of the other things I think we're able to do now is also to spot what are the species that are resilient. So someone said before about for ecological restoration, perhaps we should be focusing on species that are going to be most resilient to future climate change. Or conversely, putting more effort into the more sensitive ones with assisted migration and what have you. We don't yet see any general principles that predict which species are resilient versus which ones are sensitive. Two species of chipmunks are doing different things. Two species of Peromyscus are doing different things. What we can do through the study, though, is generate the information base that people can then use to design their restoration strategies, or decide, when do you have to panic about a species and which ones don't you need to panic about. I think we can get that. I think we can get that from the past changes. So that might be useful to a lot of managers out here.
One quick question and a quicker response.
Alex, the answer is no, I don't have time.
Well, actually, I was going to make a comment. So, the University of California Natural Reserve System was put together by three people who could be described as ecologists, Ken Norris, Bill Mayhew, and Mildred Mathias. And their principle in assembling the system initially was to get examples of all the different ecosystems of California. And of course, they focused on the fact that this is the most physiogeographically diverse state in the country. And the principle that they were pursuing was based on the fact that each of these various habitats has a different assemblage of species. So you don't find Joshua trees in the Sierra. So given that, when we talk about diversity and evolutionary rates, it's a value judgment. There's nothing absolute about it. And the state park system, for example, which is distributed throughout the state, I believe there are 272 plus sites, covers these various ecosystems. And what troubles me about focusing purely on, say, ecological drivers of evolution is that all of these habitats have physical drivers of evolution, which differ from one place to another. And whether it's species richness or species diversity that is most important. They're two different things. I mean, you can have extremes of variation. Seems to me something we can't lose sight of because we over-focus on a particular scientific choice. It may not reflect very long-term, evolutionarily most viable choices.
I think my very quick response to that would be that I agree with you that we shouldn't focus on one dimension of diversity at all. I think the more different dimensions we can look at simultaneously, the better. Whether it's functional diversity, branch lengths in phylogeny, species counts, numbers of threatened species, they're all part of the mix, but we need them all.
Okay. Thanks very much, Craig.